Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to be with us this afternoon. I understand it's raining outside, so grateful that you're here. And I'm grateful for the invitation to address this topic, which is a terribly important topic, thinking about success and thinking about your lives. I want to start with a success story about a very famous, well-known professional success in the 20th century. He was an architect. He, as a young man in early Middle Ages, began to be given projects that were terribly important. The budgets for his projects went way, way up. He was recognized for his talent, his ability, his artistry, his capacity for doing good work. It moved beyond kind of simple projects, and it moved to be given the privilege of designing whole cities, one of the greatest cities in Europe, to redesign, to think through from his architectural skills how he would build these vast sorts of projects. And he continued to do it, one after the other, rising in his fame, rising in his popularity, rising as a blazing success. He was not only a professional success, he was also a family man. From all accounts, he was a very fine, devoted family man. He had a house full of kids. He was, by all accounts, as far as I know, faithful to his wife. He was just a fine, good, middle-class, morally upright man who loved his family, loved his job. Not only that, he was also apparently a kind of guy that you would like to work next to. Accounts are that he would not talk badly about his colleagues, that he was not going to be the kind of person you would catch at the water cooler running other people down. He didn't like to talk about office politics. He didn't even like to talk about politics. He wanted to do his job, and he wanted to do it and do it well, and he did do it well. He was a blazing, incredible success. But there's one detail I haven't mentioned to you yet, and that is that he was not just any old architect, but he was, in fact, Hitler's architect. And as Minister of Armaments for the Nazis, he is credited by some by extending World War II by many months, which means, in other words, that he was responsible, according to some, somewhat single-handedly, for the deaths of many, many, many thousands of more people. He was a glorious success, and yet he was a war criminal. His name was Albert Speer. After the war, Albert Speer was arrested, and he was tried for crimes against humanity and sent to prison for his crimes. I don't know about you, but I'm haunted by the fact that, by and large, the people who helped propagate Nazi Germany were good Catholics and Lutherans. Good, middle-class, moral Catholics and Lutherans who were Christian. I'm haunted by the question of how is it possible that people who knew the gospel, people who had been baptized into Christ, could let go on what went on. How is it possible? That question haunts me. We all, of course, want to assume, if you know Dietrich Bonhoeffer, we all want to assume that we would be the Dietrich Bonhoeffers. But the facts are, of course, that most German Christians were not Dietrich Bonhoeffers, and as a matter of fact, most German Christians thought that Dietrich Bonhoeffer was somewhat wacky. In the evangelical mainstream in Germany, wrote a very scathing, prominent public document letting the likes of Bonhoeffer have it for their critiques and their criticisms. How's that possible? I want to suggest, at least today, where there's two things that we can learn from the story of Albert Speer. And I want to suggest that there might be two practices that are important for you and important for me if we're to take seriously our Christian convictions and not let our success become subservient to some rather demonic forces. Here's the first kind of thing I want to suggest that you consider. And it's illustrated by an episode in Speer's life. At one point, a friend came up to Speer during the war, and they said to Speer, he says, "Whatever you do, Albert, whatever you do," he said, "don't go to Auschwitz." It's reported that Speer, not only did Speer not go to Auschwitz, and here he is, one of the highest ranking officials in the Nazis, and he didn't go to Auschwitz. And not only did he not go to Auschwitz, when his friend said, "Whatever you do, don't go to Auschwitz," he did not even ask his friend, "Why are you telling me not to go to Auschwitz?" The theologians David Burrell and Stanley Hauerwas, in writing about this episode, they suggest to us that Speer here is a case study in the practice of self-delusion. Now, self-delusion is a tricky thing, right? Self-delusion, this notion of having been deluded by ourselves, is not a simple matter. I mean, for example, I can choose certain lies to tell myself. For example, I could try to tell myself, Camp, you're a great basketball player. Your hand-eye coordination is just brilliant. You're really good. I could stand in front of myself every morning and tell myself that, and I would still know till the day I die I'm lying to myself. That's not true. I'm not a good basketball player. So self-delusion is trickier than that. And these guys suggest one way to think about self-delusion is this. And this, if you're taking notes, this is one I suggest you write down. They say self-delusion requires a policy of a refusal to give an account for a part of one's life. Let me say that again. Self-delusion requires a policy of a refusal to give an account for a part of one's life. Think about how that works for Speer, right? So it says, whatever you do, don't go to Auschwitz. Not only does he not go, he doesn't even ask, "Why are you telling me not to go to Auschwitz?" It's this big old glaring thing that we know means the murder of 6 million Jews, and someone kind of plops it right there in the periphery, not even the periphery, but right there on his conscious radar, and he simply says, "I'm not going to talk about that. I'm not going to think about that. I'm not going to give an account for that. Let me get on to my next architectural project where I can be a success." The first sort of question, then, I think we all have to grapple with is, are we finding ways to be honest with ourselves about what we are doing with our lives? How much time? Here you are, college students, at a wonderful community of faith, and the privilege that you're being given, and the invitation that's set before you is take enough time to give an account to yourself of what you're doing with your life. Find ways to be true to yourself. Say, what am I about? What's my life about? Well, that's the first kind of big thing, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A if you want, asking questions about that, but I'm going to go to a second one that we're going to spend more time on. And that is this, that as highlighted by another kind of thing in Speer's writing, so he's tried before the Nuremberg trials, which is the famous trials after the war of war crimes. And after that, he's sent to prison. And in prison, he begins to write this biography. And he's trying to come to terms with, how did I get myself in this space where I'm one of the most prominent war criminals in the world right now? And he gets to this passage where he decides what his great failing was. And you know what he said his great failing was? He says this. He says, "I wanted, above all, to be a good architect." And that may not be very morally satisfying to you, right? We want something with much more kind of morally indicting than that. We want him to come to terms with the fact that he was just a hateful human being, that he was a rascal, that he was morally corrupt. And he said, this was my failing. I wanted, above all, to be a good architect. And maybe you find yourself at the place where you're thinking, I want, above all, just to be a good business person. Or I want, above all, to be just a good preacher. I want, above all, to be a good... What we're asked to do with this in Albert Speer's story is to ask ourselves, do we have a sufficiently large master narrative? What's the big story to which you're giving your lives? We all have competing things that we have to deal with. I'm a dad, I'm a professor, I'm a writer, all sorts of kind of commitments and responsibilities, but there has to be one master narrative, one master role, one master identity, and when push comes to shove, it's going to trump all the others. And the question laid before us with Albert Speer is, what do you want above all? That's the question. But what I want to suggest to you in the time that we have here left is I want to suggest to you 3 possible narratives that might be very prevalent, that I think are very prevalent in the world around us, to which I'm often tempted, to which you may be tempted, and ask ourselves whether these are sufficient master narratives, to ask ourselves whether we have a big enough story or not. First one, the master narrative of self-actualization. Now, I'm a theologian for a living, and I have a dirty little secret. When I confessed this dirty little secret to some of my colleagues, they snickered at me and made fun of me. And that is that as a theologian, I like reading business success books. I even like reading Tim Ferriss. If you don't know Tim Ferriss is a wacky, very interesting fellow who has book titles like The 4-Hour Work Week, Secrets of the New Rich, and stuff like that. I like reading this kind of stuff. Now, admittedly, there's some garbage among this genre, but there's also some beauty in it. They remind us that the human species is fascinating, amazing, and wondrous to behold. They remind us that small, little, petty visions suck the marrow from life and leave us wasted and frustrated. They tell us, go live large, get a big vision for what you want to do with your life. Take seriously the fact that you are a wondrous creature and take that seriously and develop it. They remind us that our brains are these amazing goal-setting apparatuses. So set goals, learn how to accomplish them, and if you haven't learned to set goals and do it, it is one of the most amazing things you'll ever do. There's all sorts of science around this called reticular activation, and that is our brains take in so much stuff that it can't possibly track all of it, and so we set lenses for ourselves about what we're going to pay attention to. And what happens when you set a goal is you actually make your mind have a lens to pay attention to the things that are coming in and possibilities that come in around you, and all of a sudden, if you set a goal and you pay attention and you keep reminding yourself, before you know it, you're making progress in ways you never dreamed you could if you don't set the goal. Your brains and bodies are goal-setting apparatuses, and it's wonderful to learn how that stuff works. And it does work. Then, too, they remind us, learn to face your vices. Listen, my friends, vices, habits, disposition, skills that lead us to destruction, we all have them. We've all got them. The question becomes whether we'll face them square or not and learn to deal with them. And a lot of this kind of literature takes very seriously. Look, don't let yourself be taken down by these stupid bad habits that can destroy your life. Learn how to root them out of your lives. Learn how to give them up and let them go. Face them. But don't just root out the ill. Cultivate your life in wonderful ways. Cultivate intellectual virtue. If you're an English major, I suggest that you go learn a little bit about theoretical physics and cosmological principles. I'm a theologian person, but I like to read stories about the history of the universe. And earlier this year, I'm reading this book about cosmology and how to get our heads around the notion of the universe and galaxies. And here's an example that just blows my mind. Here we are in the Milky Way galaxy. You want to know how many stars there are in the Milky Way galaxy? Where you take a 1 meter box cube and you fill it with sand and let every grain of sand represent one star. Can you imagine how many grains of sand that is? How many stars? But then you have to have 300 of those boxes to get how big the Milky Way galaxy is. Our big neighbor, what is it called? Andromeda. The scientists should help me if I'm doing this wrong. You have to have 1,000 of those boxes to get that galaxy. That's just 2 galaxies. And they don't even know how many galaxies there are in the universe. If you're an English major, you better know that kind of stuff. Right? And if you're a scientist, you better go read some good literature if you ever hope to be able to communicate the brilliance that you're learning in the science lab. Cultivate intellectual virtues. Learn about the rise and fall of civilizations. Learn about political constructs which have been tried and tested, failed, or succeeded. Learn to read philosophy. Do some calculus. Learn how to bake cookies. Learn, too, how to cultivate physical virtues. Get yourself in the car and drive up there to Colorado and climb a 14er if you've never done it before. Learn to, if you're terrified of heights, work it up so that, as one of my students did when I pushed him on courage, she was terrified of heights, and she told me at the end of the semester, you know, I've been working on that. And I said, yeah. And she said, you know what I did last week? And I said, no, what? She said, I jumped out of an airplane. Work on it. Set yourself goals and go cultivate the virtues, the physical virtues. Cultivate social virtues. There's nothing as beautiful as eating and drinking and celebrating well with friends who are trustworthy and kind. It's a joy like none other to truly learn to cultivate the goods of friendship. I was very friendly and sociable when I was younger and your age, but I never learned to be a good friend until I hit my 30s. And I can tell you that there's a sweetness to friendship and a possibility of being human in friendship like none other. And if you haven't learned to cultivate it yet, go learn to do it. Learn to take your dang phone and stick it in your pocket or leave it in your dorm room. And learn to look people in the eye and pay attention to them and learn how to read their faces and read social cues and learn to study people, because people are amazing and wonderful. Yes, my friends, do learn self-actualization. And if the narrow-minded preachers start putting down things like this, I encourage you just to chuckle at them and move on forward. Because we dare not take all the wonder and the beauty and the talents that God has given us and bury it in the dirt. But if self-actualization is our master narrative, woe be unto us. Not because on its own it's a bad narrative, not because it's untrue on its own, but because it's too small on its own, and any partial truth taken as the whole truth becomes a lie and a deadly one. Here's the second narrative I want to suggest you think about. And we'll start with Aristotle. Aristotle insisted that justice had to be one of the four cardinal virtues. He said, look, we can focus on the kind of self-actualization kind of stuff. We can become virtuous men and women. But if the focus is merely upon ourselves, he insisted, then we could not rightly flourish, because we are, as he put it, social creatures. If the focus is merely upon our own self-flourishing to the neglect of the community around us, then we will miserably fail, said Aristotle. And this is something that Moses as well insisted upon, that the 8th century BC prophets, Hebrew prophets like Amos insisted on, that Jesus insists upon. That community, social justice, that the life of the community and politics and human history, that all these things matter. Don't let any religion teach you that these things don't matter. But the danger lies, and I'm going to go through some stuff. I'm going to ask you to follow me kind of closely because it's important the way I say this, okay? The danger lies in giving divine status, inappropriate authority, or Messiah-like hope to the communities in which we find ourselves. The danger in loving our community lies in seeing God, seeing the right, always and simply on our side of the wall and not on the other. Or maybe even worse, thinking that might makes right and concluding that God is on the side of the mighty. You hear what I'm saying? Are y'all with me on this? See, this sort of rhetoric that sees God on our side, that sees right on our side, this is a very long-standing American tradition. Thomas Jefferson said, "The United States was the world's best hope." Abraham Lincoln, he called the United States the last best hope of earth. Similarly, my friends, I want to suggest to you that you pay attention. That when a new president tells us to give total allegiance to our nation, this is a move beyond love of neighbor, and this is the move to idolatry. This is a move beyond love of neighbor, and it is a move toward idolatry. Lincoln and Jefferson and the nationalists of our day as well are not wrong to love their neighbor. They're not wrong to love justice. They're not wrong to love freedom. They are simply wrong to assume that our people are preferred over other people's. They're wrong to assume that the American drama is synonymous with the drama of God's redemption of human history. They are wrong to assume a godlike divinization of our country that has no right claiming total allegiance of anyone. Now, this is not a peculiarly American sin. When Albert Speer was serving as Hitler's architect, this is what Nazi soldiers had on their belt buckles. Gott mit uns. Nazi soldiers had on their belt buckle, God with us. The idolatrous exaltation of land and people and soil is an appalling corporate sin with a bloody, long history. I want to suggest to you to beware and do not be deceived. This sort of rhetoric is the rhetoric of Nebuchadnezzar, and it's the rhetoric of Babylon, in light of which Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had hard choices to make before the fiery furnace. If you haven't read that story in a long while, you might want to go back and read it. It's almost like a story for our day. But you know what's happening there at the fiery furnace, before the fiery furnace? The patriotic music is playing. National anthem is being sung. And the question is, are you going to get on your knee? And everybody gets on their knees as the patriotic heart stirrings are astir, except Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who stand. And next thing they know, they're in that fiery furnace. When gone to seed, the nationalist narrative gives birth to an illegitimate hope that is deadly. And again, it's not love of neighbor that's wrong. It's not love of community that's wrong. It's not love of justice that's wrong. It's love of us and exclusion to them. It's our God over here and not our God over there. That's very viciously dangerous. Well, many will rush in with a third master narrative, the religion card. Need a good master narrative? Well, religion's got it. Now, in spite of the fact that I make a living talking about religion and theology, I would suggest to you that you should be aware of the fact that the religion card is a dangerous one. Because in the same way that some make idols of themselves and others make idols of the nation state, others make idols of their interpretation of the divine. And a fast-talking idolater can make a convert twice the child of hell, to borrow Jesus' words. Now, I come at this particular kind of observation very personally. I have often called myself a recovering shame addict. Because in my childhood religious experience, I was schooled in shame. I was schooled in taboos. I was schooled in narrow-minded notions of what would send one to hell. And it gets deeply in one's psyche, and it can take you a long time, even a really, really deep midlife crisis with a 2.5-year-long depression before you start to get over some of that stuff. So I'm very impatient with the religion card that gets dealt in a way that is destructive. There comes a time when we must ask ourselves whether the religious doctrines on which we have been nursed are in service to freedom or in service to bondage, whether they exalt a beautiful and loving and just and merciful God or a nitpicking, shallow-minded, capricious idol of a God. Which reminds me of this old beautiful story, which I'm sure some of you know, from Huck Finn. You remember that time that Huck Finn going down the Mississippi River with the runaway slave, Jim? Huck Finn is all torn up because he knows he's done wrong. He's helped a runaway slave, and he knows he's going to go to hell. And so finally, so convinced he's going to go to hell if he doesn't repent, he takes out a sheet of paper and he writes down what he's done. And he writes down how he helped Jim run away. And he writes down how the master can find Jim and get back his runaway slave. And he finally writes it and he gets it all done and he sets it aside and he says he felt this kind of flush of peace and forgiveness just flush over him because he had finally confessed his wrong. And he says, but then he began to think of Jim's humanity. And this is what he says. He says, I got to thinking over our trip down the river, and I see Jim before me in the day and in the nighttime, moonlight, storms, and we are floating along, talking, singing, laughing. I'd see him standing my watch on top of his instead of calling me so I could go on sleeping. And I see him how glad he was when I come back out of the fog, and when I come to him again in the swamp, how he'd always call me honey. He'd do everything he could think of for me and how good he always was. And last I remembered I saved him by telling the men we had smallpox aboard. And he was so grateful and said I was the best friend old Jim ever had in the world and the only one he's got now. And then I happened to look around and I see that paper. It was a close place. I took it up and I held it in my hand and I was a-trembling, he says. Because I got to decide forever betwixt two things, and I noted. I studied a minute, sort of holding my breath, and then I says to myself, all right then, I'll go to hell. And I tore it up. It could be too then that our religion is too small and a deadly one. So, there is undoubtedly as much bad religion as there is idolatrous love of country and idolatrous love of self. But none of this means that we are exempt from finding a big enough, true enough story in which to join our lives and to give our lives. And so I hope you'll consider this possibility. The big true story of a God who comes among us, enfleshed like us, does the hard work of learning how to live well, of learning virtues, of doing kind of self-actualization kind of stuff, of learning to tell the truth and to have courage. Can you imagine the courage it took in time to stand before Pilate? But this one does not just focus upon self-actualization and self-development, because this bigger, truer story also seeks first God's work in the world and its justice. Don't forget, a great way to translate Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount is to seek first the kingdom of God and its justice. He teaches us to practice mercy and welcome foreigners and to love our enemies. And he speaks the truth. Jesus speaks the truth to the superpower of his day, too. And insists that God alone is to be given total allegiance. And in this big, true story, this God incarnate vents his most intense anger at the purveyors of bad religion that weighs down good souls with self-hatred, and he proclaims instead a truth promised to set us free, a liberty and joy like none other. My friends, I plead with you, don't saddle yourself with too small a story. Don't be successful that way. There is so much glorious beauty and truth and adventure waiting us in the world to live a life of a much more true success to which we all get to be invited. Amen.
The room's kind of large, and we don't have a microphone, I just realized. But if you have a question for the good of the order.
This one on. Check, check. This one on. Check, 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 check. We could pass that one around if you want.
Okay. We'd be happy to let somebody ask a question.
Be fun if somebody gives us some argumentative questions. That would be much more fun if we could get somebody to argue or fuss with us. So, I've been called every name in the book, so you're not going to bother me any.
So I'll start off and ask, when did you realize what your master narrative was going to be?
I think for me, it's always a process of unfolding. That, you know, I remember having a kind of a calling experience when I was a 12-year-old, but I didn't really understand what that was or what it meant until years later. And so for me, I think it's always an unfolding process where we keep seeking, keep looking.
It relates to the narrative of, love of country. So I've heard from multiple students at LCU that it's bad to pledge allegiance. And would you say that pledging allegiance is like pledging allegiance to an idol?
That's a great question. I'll speak just for myself. I was probably 27, 28, and I had gone home, and I was, my dad used to always take me to the Kiwanis Club. I loved going to Kiwanis Club with my dad, and some of my best high school memories are being at Kiwanis Club eating lunch with my dad, and I loved those men in that group. And finally, by the time I went back in my 20s, they had permitted women to come in. And I remember in my late 20s, they stood to say the Pledge of Allegiance, and for the first time, I remember thinking, I can't say this. And for me, and you all have to process this on your own, but for me, my baptism is my Pledge of Allegiance. Because my baptism is where I'm saying I give myself to the Lordship of Christ as my authority for my life. And so for me, they stand in some rather direct contradiction. I know some people who have suggested that they say the Pledge of Allegiance as one nation under God. And they say it's with that caveat that I say this, which if you're going to do it, I would think that you need to have some sort of notion like that. But I will note quickly one historical note, as I understand this, the one nation under God was added during the Eisenhower administration. And Eisenhower one time said, listen to this line, I think I'm getting the quote pretty much word for word. He said, democracy makes no sense unless its citizenry has a deeply held religious faith. And then he said, and I don't care what kind of faith it is. See, what happens in a quote like that is what they're doing. They're saying what we need God for here is to prop up democracy. And it doesn't matter what the God faith is, just as long as something props up the democracy. Well, there's that same administration under which we have the addition of under God to the Pledge of Allegiance. So historically as well, it creates some problems. And the last kind of historical note that creates some problems for me is that the man who wrote the Pledge of Allegiance at one time said that he intended for the Pledge of Allegiance to operate in the formation of school children the same way the Lord's Prayer operates to form church children, which in my mind is deeply problematic as well. So for a variety of those reasons, I find it to be a problematic practice. Thanks for the great question.
Anyone else? Well, I'm going to turn it over to President Perrin. Thank you, Dr. Kent.